When the deeper awakening shift happened for me in spring 2022, it was preceded by specific changes, in my process, and kind of perceptual foretastes, of what was to come. So I thought I would speak about awakening in this video from that perspective, like what was happening just before the shift to non-duality, like what was happening just before the very fabric of reality disintegrated. Because that's how it felt like for me, that this space-time fabric of being, it felt like that deeper truth of what I am. It was almost like tearing itself apart and revealing that astonishing, empty, radiant nature. So for me, the shift to non-duality means collapse of these three fundamental pillars of existence: the space, time, and self. And they kind of come together. So if one of them thoroughly collapses at the root of our being, the other two are bound to collapse as well. That's at least my understanding of it. So preceding the shift, I had arrived in an interesting place in my own explorations. Like the first awakening had happened, and I was fully committed to the path. It had kind of taken over my life and consumed me and consumed my life, and I was very happy with that. I was very happy to know that my life was about awakening and liberation, even though I didn't know what it would mean. But it was exciting, this experience of free fall, and this experience of falling in love with the unknown. So it started to become very clear for me that any desire for reality to be anything other than it is would somehow be a way of negating the truth that is right in front of my eyes. And this was a bit of a Koan type of situation for me, because even though it was clear that what is right in front of my eyes, it must be truth, at the same time I knew that I'm not yet fully seeing it, that there's more to it. But at the same time, I started to experience that any attempt to desire for my experience to be anything other than it is would, in a strange way, be a way of turning away from that truth. Even that truth wasn't yet clear to me experientially. And this showed up in so many ways, in very simple and practical ways. Like it became clear that there's no reason to believe that these thoughts that are occurring in the moment, that they should not be happening. And that was, in its simplicity, kind of like radical insight for me. It was extremely funny for me and a source of huge relief that I realized that why should I believe that these thoughts shouldn't be happening? Is there any reason to believe that they should not be happening? So I had been struggling so much with my mind unconsciously, and I was just coming to this place of conscious recognition of that struggle, in which it just naturally seemed to evaporate, and leaving me to this place where I kind of felt cornered, by reality. I felt like the whole awakening process had cornered me, and I couldn't really see the way to go further, even though I sensed and knew that there is further. So I was kind of asked to surrender to what is, and in a way relinquished that deep desire for liberation as anything other than what is. So experientially, it felt like that something was just starting to dissolve, that there was this mystery about it, that whatever this is right now, it must be it. And whenever I would just step into that mystery, all the thought processes would cease, and all these thoughts about my life or about the path or about anything really, they would just cease, and I would be just taken over by a kind of deep reverence for this mystery. So in a sense, it was like a subtle heart opening that was starting to occur already there, like prior to the shift. And it was a beautiful place to be. Like, it was actually a place where I felt very happy in many ways. I felt in alignment with my life. I felt in alignment with the path. And it didn't mean that there were no challenges, because after the first awakening, I was constantly invited to meet this type of shadow material and trauma that was arising in the experience. So I was familiar with that type of processing, and inner work. And somehow it had been occurring on its own without me really having contact to teachers who would be able to talk about that or explain me what was happening to me. Somehow I was proceeding with intuition, and I didn't understand what was happening. But there was a sense that came to me a few months before the release that this is it, you're almost there. Like, it's almost done, the work. The work meaning that type of processing of this type of psychic material where the identity was bound to at the level of unconsciousness. So at least in my experience, that type of material needed to be penetrated by awareness and assimilated up until a point that the identity was able to disentangle and release itself from that material. And that's when the shift basically happened. And that doesn't mean that there is no more shadow material or that there was no more shadow material to process. Like, obviously, we are never above the shadow work. And there was definitely a whole of whole of another reality of the shadow work that opened up after non-dual realization. But I do recall that there was this very clear moment, like prior to the shift, when I was being told that like it's almost done and I'm ready. And something that was very much part of my practice at that time was a type of a somatic inquiry, which was also a form of non-dual inquiry when I'm looking at it now. So I would have a lot of pain and tension and contraction, physically speaking, in my body. And during that time, I was, for the first time in my life, able to get closer and closer to it, like in a direct experience, just feeling it directly for what it is. So for some reason, that hadn't really been accessible for me before. So I would often just be led into these places where I would feel these places in the body and feel the narratives and images connected to the contraction, and I would just stay with the contraction and feel the pain or feel the emotions that were showing up. And often that was connected with an experience of Kundalini really activating and starting to process that material. I would kind of feel that I became that energy in those moments. I became Kundalini and I was digesting that energy, and it was very, very intuitive and kind of shamanic. And I was just purely trusting that and proceeding by instinct. And that would then lead me to a type of non-dual experience of the body, like unexpectedly. Like when that shadow material started to release, suddenly there would be a very clear experience that the body is actually unborn and uncreated, that its essence is this immaculate emptiness and boundlessness. And it brought tears to my eyes and touched me so deeply, to realize the innocence of the body and the beauty of it when it's allowed to express itself freely and reveals its true nature. The nature of pure sensation is really this a radiance, like this empty radiance. And the more we are able to just immerse in the direct experience and impure sensation, everything disappears into that, because that's all there really is. And sometimes these non-dual glimpses, they came with a very beautiful states of formlessness. And I wasn't thinking it in these terms at the time when it was occurring, but afterwards I've sometimes missed that period of my life, because if you followed the unfettering model by Kevin Shanelek, you maybe noticed that after the sixth and seventh fetters drop away and we realize formlessness, it's not possible anymore to enter in states, in any kind of states, which is a little bit weird experience initially, like this stateless state. So for me, there was a little bit of a longing of that period of my journey when I was still able to enter in this type of extremely kind of pure and inspired and elevated state of formless awareness, where sometimes any sense of a perceiver would dissolve in this type of kind of shining blackness, similar to a deep sleep, just with a clarity that we usually don't experience in connection with the deep sleep. So I would feel this Kundalini was somehow inseparable from that luminous void. Like it would clear out these energetic blockages and traumas in my body. And the more it was able to do that, it would always result in these tastes, glimpses of eternity, like experientially. It was almost like drinking this otherworldly nectar that was just pervading my whole being and leaving me totally refreshed. So it was a weird combination of a bit of a mystical experiences with very kind of physically messy purging and cathartic release and emotional work. And then with a kind of neutral type of non-dual inquiry into the sense experience, into the boundlessness, into the experience of space and distance, and discovering this timeless radiance, right? So I talked about earlier these three pillars of duality, like time and space and self. So it's very beautiful when they start to collapse, and they can start to collapse also in a gentle manner, or they can collapse in a very radical manner, all of them, or one of them. So it's it's a beautiful part of the process, I think. Even it can be also messy in its own way, and we don't really know what's happening, at least for myself. When I look back into it, I was kind of stumbling around in the dark. That's how it appears like I couldn't see my way around, but basically I was doing exactly the same stuff that I'm doing now, this type of inquiry, like whenever shadow material or contraction appears, this type of inquiry processing just happens spontaneously. But it's very different experience of now, because there is this sense of illumination and clarity, right? So this self-liberation that is occurring. So I was kind of starting to discover that at that time, but without knowing what it was and without still being able to see. But I was starting to intuitively discover that self-liberating functioning in tiny, tiny little bits, like it would open up. And after the shift to non-duality, then it would start to open up in a lot more, I guess, conscious manner. And at that time, I kind of felt that my whole life had disappeared into the path. And for me, that felt very liberating. I wasn't concerned about anything. I wasn't concerned about past, and I wasn't concerned about future. And I felt this unshakable confidence that this is what I'm supposed to do, even though it's not a doing, and I'm not really even there. So the doership was also starting to fall away at this phase of the journey without me really even noticing, mostly through these experiences of Kundalini activating and starting to process this material, when I felt that no one was really doing it. Like there was no individual agency in that type of digestion or processing. And at the same time, I was fully taking the form of that experience. And at the same time, there was no personal agency. So that would kind of open up, and then it would close, and the sense of apparent persona would reappear. And it was very, very transparent at this phase, the sense of some sort of individual existence. Like it was kind of like a faint appearance, kind of almost like diluted. Like I didn't really anymore experience myself in that way, like as an actually existing entity or an individual, but it hadn't fully dropped away. Like the experience of Vivi, it was kind of just become gradually more and more simplified, and more and more layers had been fallen away, and it wasn't anymore any kind of substantial experience of continuity. It would come and go, but there was still a faint remnant of some sort of inherent existence about that experience of Vivi. And that was what then fully dissolved with the non-dual awakening, like with full clarity, this seeing that the person was always just a kind of cloth, that it was never what it appeared to be. And a big part of my practice was a kind of daily attunement with the intention of wanting to know truth directly. So that was something that I kept coming back to within myself experientially again and again and again and again. Like the first thing that I woke up and during the day, and the last thing, it was last thing in my mind when I would go to sleep. And that intention was very, very powerful for me. Like very powerful. And sometimes I felt even this type of ecstatic devotion, kind of like just this kind of like experience of self-giving. And it was definitely the fundamental organizing principle in my life at that time. And eventually it did lead me to this place where I realized that this must be it. Like this is it. Even though I don't understand what it means and I haven't fully realized it, but the path completely disappeared, or the idea of a path that could be anything other than this. So that's where this intention brought me, this intention to directly experience truth. And then it just left me there. And when I was attuning with that intention, something started to shift in me in regards to that. It started to feel a bit different. Because until that moment, even though I knew when this like all-consuming intention appeared in my system and took over, I knew that it was not about me. It was beyond this like individual existence, and I knew that the awakening was not for me. So I wasn't in that sense pursuing it because of wanting anything from it. At that point, I had lost interest in anything like that. I was just feeling this desperate need to know truth directly, no matter the price. And I was actually almost like prepared that it could physically kill me, which may sound irrational or dramatic, but having had this Kundalini awakening and these type of really powerful, energetic openings where sometimes it feels like your heart is about to stop or about to, it feels almost like a heart attacked the intensity. And I faced a few times this intensity in such a sudden way, like it would just explode in my systems, and it felt like I was about to die. But but it would lead to non-dual openings every time when I was able to fully relax and surrender into that. But I faced that fear of death, and I was okay with it, because my life is already, I've lost everything, so I didn't really feel like I had anything to hold on to, and I was okay with the option of it possibly even being physically, energetically, like kind of consuming me like that. I wasn't really consciously thinking about it, but yeah. So often when I was attuning with this intention, it also came with the understanding that there could be a price to this, and I was reflecting on it, and I was kind of confirming that decision that no matter the price, so be it. There were other core fears that also showed up for me, but that was one of the main ones for sure, like this fear of death, like this process actually killing me. But at that time, just before the shift, when I was just feeling into the intention, like it was my daily kind of spontaneous practice to do, something started to shift in that, and it started to more formulate itself like as a contribution. So until that point, I just needed to know the truth for my own sake, in that sense, because I felt it wasn't an option anymore to continue living in the way that I had lived so far. Like I needed to break out. I needed to break free fully, all the way through. But suddenly there was this new flavor to that, which was contribution. And it felt just very curious to me, like when I was feeling like, what's the most important thing in my life? And then it appeared, this desire to be able to contribute. And I didn't know what that meant, but it had a different flavor to it. And I think that was also part of that subtle heart opening that was already starting to occur at that time. And how the shift finally ended up happening was that I had another wave of Kundalini moving through the system, which was actually quite brutal, and a core trauma that I had been processing for quite some time. It was kind of fully surfacing, like a sexual trauma, and I was reliving it, and there was again this experience of being the energy, being Kundalini, and digesting, karma, digesting energy, digesting conditioning, and there was this very powerful purging experience, but it was also kind of overwhelming for the system because of the intensity, and I went to a kind of shock state because of the intensity of the digestion. I felt that it was too much, or it was too much. Like I didn't have the capacity to digest that shadow material with the speed that it was emerging. Like suddenly the unconsciousness was just totally open, and it was just flood, and Kundalini had taken over, and this processing was occurring. But then I went to this state of overwhelm, or the nervous system went to this state of total overwhelm and shock. And I did recover from that. But the next 2 or 3 days, I felt kind of in a very open and a bit of a fragile place, kind of destabilized. Also in a weird way, very much empowered, but also confused. Yeah, I guess now feeling back into it, it was kind of like I felt that these remnants of control they were collapsing, like they had collapsed with that experience of that powerful trauma, digestion, purging, and Kundalini taken over, and they have led me into this state where I was kind of just shaking and starting to realize that I'm not in charge at all. And 2 or 3 days after this happened, I wake up in the morning and feeling this destabilization and a bit of almost like an agitation, but not in a negative sense. But there was this kind of subtle but quite intense sense of agitation and restlessness, subtle sense of restlessness. And I would wake up and do everything I'm doing in the morning, but it was there. And it was noticeable for me. And what I suddenly realized when I then fully allowed myself to feel that restlessness and agitation and a little bit like a panic energy was that this whole process where I had been, like this whole awakening path, but especially this last phase of it, these last couple of years, this immense push that I've made, like really given my whole life to it and being almost like obsessed about it, in a beneficial way. And suddenly it just dawned on me that this is it. Like it failed. And this message, it didn't come from the mind. Like it felt like it came from the gut. Like it really emerged, that these words. And I knew that it was real. It was this kind of shocking, but undeniable truth of this effort that I've made, of channeling all my energy and all my willpower into it. And it had led me to this place where the control was crumbling. And suddenly I realized that I failed. I failed. I failed. This whole thing failed. And it was so shocking for me because when I say that I'm going to attain enlightenment, no matter the price, I knew that there wasn't a second option. And this may sound very egoic, and maybe it was, but this was genuinely how I felt about it. So when the message came, this total failure that I felt with my whole body, my whole being, it just kind of collapsed into this experience of failure. I knew it was real and I knew it was incomprehensible, and yet it had happened. And I wasn't able to think about it. I just collapsed. And then I sit down on my meditation because it was in the morning, and that's what I would always do in the morning, that I would sit down to this inquiry, spontaneous meditation. And the moment I sit down and closed my eyes and relaxed into it, that was the moment. There was this final letting go, or this final release. That's when it happened. And yeah, it kind of felt like that sense of centering, which is at the root of being a person. That center was kind of like exploding. And suddenly I wasn't able to locate myself anymore. It suddenly felt like the psyche was completely boundless, and all these psychic processes that had been previously somehow contained, now they were just kind of like floating in this infinite vastness and freedom where nothing was gluing them together or holding them together. So that was what the control was. It was this energy that apparently holds the person or psyche together. So when that completely releases, then this non-dual boundlessness is realized. this incredible freedom and lightness and unity. But it can be initially quite a trip, right? Quite an unfolding, because there's so much psychic energy bound, that to that center, bound to that experience of being a person, being an individual, and even though a lot of that energy had already been released in this awakening process, like gradually, or in these sudden moments of processing the shadow material and release occurring. So every time that had been happening, some of that psychic energy had been released and kind of transmuted into bliss. That's how it felt to me. But in that moment, that fundamental root of it, or the center of it, was severed and released, and there was a lot of bliss as a result. That was feeling the experience, like this pure, uncreated joy. And I felt so peaceful at the same time when this was happening, when this happened. Like there was no fear. It was absolutely awe-inspiring. I would look around and just in amazement, because I was looking around and seeing myself as everything. And at the same time, I felt very quiet and very peaceful. There was this silence that I had woken up that morning, which had been there underneath the agitation and underneath the restlessness. So that silence became all-pervading. And there was this incredible fluidity to this way of experiencing, because the struggle was completely gone. Almost like this type of otherworldly flow, that everything was just occurring very synchronistically, almost like magically, without any agency or doership. And yet I was fully present and fully embodied. And everything was so beautiful. And I was tasting this non-dual radiance, or kind of almost like bathing in it. Prior to that, I had been tasting it, but now it was like a full immersion, and I drowned in it, and there wasn't any more me left. It was just it experiencing itself directly without any intermediary. So all in all, for me, it was a kind of collapse of these scaffolds of reality, like Angela sometimes calls them. And it took about 10 days or 2 weeks, and there were further insights and further unfoldings. And it all culminated in a kind of experience of total cessation or death, and a realization of formlessness and emptiness. But in this video, I wanted to focus more on what was happening just before the release, and how it all culminated in that experience of letting go, in that experience of failure. And yeah, of course, this is just a story for entertainment purposes, perhaps. It's the best that I'm able to describe something that is very hard to put in words, and which I'm aware that it's always going to be an interpretation of something that is beyond any comprehension or conceptualization, and that is so nuanced and rich that any way of describing it, it's always going to be a limitation. But this is the way that my system has been processing it within the past years, that it appears to me in this form, the story. And I do think it maybe has also some value of insight and perception, and that's why I'm sharing it. Obviously, not just for the entertainment purposes, because there are some universal aspects to this awakening process, and perhaps there are some of these themes that I was articulating here that you are recognizing also in your own experience.